I'm Aakash Gupta. Today my topic is current account deficit. Before understanding current account deficit, we should first understand what is balance of payment. Balance of payment is nothing but it is a transaction between residents and non-resident in terms of goods, services and income. What is then current account deficit? In normal terms, we can say it is a decrease in the foreign exchange reserves or increase in the net capital flows. Also, we can say current account deficit is nothing but the difference between the gross national savings and investment. Whatever we are saving in our national and whatever we are investing, the difference between them is the current account balance. Why we are so much focused about the current account deficit, even though some countries like Australia and New Zealand are doing better, really good, even when their current account deficit is pretty much high, while some of the countries like China has current account surpluses. So why we are worried about so much? So we will first of all look into the context, the history of the current account deficit in India, then what all the steps have been taken by the government and what should not have been taken, what should be taken by the government. So coming to the history, in 18th century India was an open economy. It was one of the largest exporter in terms of merchandise. In 19th century, the India turned to the agriculture exports, but say it was one of the largest exporters in the world. During the colonial rule, the external sector deteriorated, but still India remained the top 10 exporter in the world. We can say the journey like this. India's total merchandise export of the total world was 2.5% in 1949 to 50, which uh, decreased to 0.5% in 1980s. So that way you can just imagine how the trade, in terms of trade, India lagged behind the world. To come up with this, the devaluation was done by the government in 1966 by almost 36.5%, so that the export become cheaper and the India can actually reduce the current account deficit in some or the other terms. So in why was the 1991 crisis actually happened? So in 1980s, but it actually started in the 1980s. What were the problems? There were some major oil shocks in the 1980, deterioration in the export growth. As we can see, the Indian industries was not that competitive. Legal restrictions were there on various industries, the quota restrictions and all. Large public spending was there. The expenditure was greater than the revenue that the government earned. So in terms, the government has to actually finance that deficit in some way or the other. And there was a huge dependency on the debt flows and the short-term flows. We will discuss about it later why it is harmful. And also one of the major reasons was the exchange rate was fixed by the Indian government. So coming to the current scenario, like 1 decade or 2 decade back, we can say the India's export basket is mainly dominated by the manufacturing sector. Manufacturing sector in terms we can say low engineering products, some gems and jewelries are also there. But but the share of manufacturing as a share of total manufacturing, world manufacturing is just 1.6% in 2012. Since we are not that much competitive, which we can see, the agriculture, textiles have been decreasing in terms of export, while our dependency on petroleum as a developing country is increasing day by day. India's export percentage was to 2.2% in 1948, which goes down to 0.2% in 1980s, and then it again increased to somehow improved a little bit. That's it, 1.6% in 2012. So, what are the major factors which are leading to the increase in exports? It is petroleum, crude and crude products, the gold. Why is gold becoming a so much important commodity in the in the import portfolio of India? Actually, in cases of inflation, be it low or high, gold is used as a hedging against inflation. That is one reason, and the second reason is Indian household has a craze for jewelry, of course, so which is pretty much unproductive in terms of economy. So to come up to counter this, the restrictions have been put by the government on the gold import. Like the import duty has been increased to 2 to 10% on the oil imports, and there is a restriction on the import of the gold coins, And also there is a new policy by the government in which the 20% of total imports of the gold has to be exported back to the other countries. Like it's a legal restriction which has to be fulfilled. Now the trade deficit is a major factor which lead to the current account deficit, which is being compensated by the services, actually the invisibles which we say commonly in terms of economics. uh, Basically the increase in the trade deficit is mainly due to the increase in the imports in terms of gold, oil, and the deceleration in export. We are talking in about 2004, which is still, I can say, the situation somewhat or the other like the same even today. So the current account deficit, if we look at the figures in the history, it was 1.6% in 2006 to 10, which increased to 3.4% in 2008 to 10, which I think it's pretty much okay looking at the financial global crisis because of fiscal stimulus. But still, the fiscal stimulus was so large that it did not increase that much. But why? We'll talk about that later. Then it goes on to increase to 4.8% in 2012 to 13. Now there is a prolonged deficit term, which is basically the loan that have been taken by the Indian government over the past year. The interest and the principal obligation is so much high that it is putting so much pressure on the budget of the government that the government actually has to finance those payments. Like in one of the budget, I don't remember the budget year, but 25 lakh crore was the budget and 6 lakh crore was the interest payment only. So that is the prolonged deficit effect. Post global crisis period, we can say the savings and the interest rate started decreasing. But what happened? The saving rate started decreasing more than the investment rate. After that, what happened? That gap is being actually financed by the current account deficit in the government sector, in the public sector. So the household sector, on the irony, saves more than it invests. There was an FRPM Act in 2003 launched by the government in which the SI gap, that is the saving investment gap of the public sector, has to be improved. Actually, it improved a little bit because of the government doing less capital expenditure than the revenue expenditure, which is again harmful for the economy. But it again deteriorated in 2008 and 9 because of financial crisis, because of fiscal stimulus provided by the government. The SI gap of the public sector, as I talked about earlier, was offset in 2008 and 9 because of the decrease in the private deficit, and the household savings was put into use. That is why that fiscal stimulus that was provided by the government was not did not have that much large impact, but after that it did have a large impact the on the current account deficit. Basically, to counter the current account deficit, the government is majorly reliable on the invisibles, but that too again the remittances and the income that is being earned from the abroad, uh, that is again not that much dependable because of the shocks. As we can see some examples, the crisis in Dubai, US, and Europe. Also, the government is highly dependent on the short-term financing, like debt financing and the short-term financing, which should be avoided, which actually led to the crisis in the 1991. Majorly, we avoid such because they are quite vulnerable. The investors can exit the market at the time of volatility, and again, the government has to suffer from the current account deficit, which can now be seen in the current economic scenario as well, because of the lack of long-term capital or the investment in the equity capital. Government is actually encouraging the short-term inflow of the funds or the debt financing. um, just a fun fact, or yeah, so there is a relation between current account deficit and inflation. How it is? Uh, Inflation, when it is low, in let's say example, we take the example of 2016 when the inflation was low, the interest provided in the deposit rate was also low. Because of that, people think nominally actually it is like that. So people think that their principal is getting deteriorated and they're not getting that much interest rate. But in the real terms, people were better off because let's say inflation was 2%, the interest rate that they were getting was 3%. Actually, the people were better off, but they cannot actually think like that. So and because there was less deposit, the government has to look for the other sources of finance, which again lead to the current account deficit. Thank you.